The song that made me famous was a song I wrote for my dying wife, and the man who stole it was standing 3 feet away from me, accepting an award for it, while my 6-year-old son watched from the front row and asked me why the bad man was holding Mama's song. That was the night I decided that a quiet man from the Treme was going to take down the biggest record label in the South with nothing but the truth and a tape recorder my grandfather left me. If you want to hear how it ends and how a heartbroken white girl from Iowa with a voice like broken glass ended up saving my life and my son's, then stay right here and subscribe now, because the people in this story paid lawyers a great deal of money to make sure you never would. My name is Andre Toussaint, and I make music in New Orleans, which is a little like saying you make bread in a bakery. It's the whole air of the place. It's in the water. You don't choose it so much as it grows on you. I grew up in the Treme, the oldest black neighborhood in America, where a funeral turns into a parade and a stranger's front porch becomes a concert if the right somebody sits down at the right piano. My grandfather, Papa Joe, played trumpet with men whose names are on the walls of the Jazz Museum now, and he raised me after my mother couldn't. He taught me piano on an upright that was missing 3 keys, and he taught me the most important thing I know, which is that a song isn't the notes. The notes are just the boat. The song is the river underneath, and the river is always somebody's true feeling, or it's nothing at all. Let me tell you about Papa Joe, because you can't understand me without him. He was a small man with enormous hands and a laugh you could hear across a street, and he'd played in the great days, the days when this neighborhood produced more genius per block than anywhere on earth, and he'd been cheated out of every dollar of it. That's the part. Nobody tells you about the golden age of this music. The men who made it mostly died poor because there was always a Lionel, always a white suit, always a contract they didn't understand handed to them by a man who smiled. Papa Joe used to say, they own the paper, Andre, but they can't own the river. Remember that. You can steal a song off a page. You can't steal it out of the air where it was born. I thought it was just an old man's comfort. I didn't understand until much later that he was handing me the exact weapon I'd need. He raised me on that upright piano with the 3 dead keys, and he made me learn to play around the broken notes to make the song work anyway. And I have thought 1,000 times since that he was teaching me how to live and calling it music. He recorded everything on that reel-to-reel, every kid he taught, every session on the porch, every idea that came to him at 3 in the morning, because he'd lost so much of his own music to men who erased his name, and he'd sworn that nothing that came through his hands would ever go unwitnessed again. That reel-to-reel is the whole reason I still have a life to tell you about. A poor man's paranoia, born of being robbed his whole life, turned out to be the one thing a rich man couldn't outlawyer. I was never going to be famous. I want you to understand that about me. I'm not a spotlight man. I'm a back-of-the-club man, a play till 3 in the morning man, a man who's happiest when nobody's looking at him, and the room is just breathing along with the piano. For most of my life, that was enough. I played sessions. I taught kids. I wrote songs that other people sang, and I was married to the only woman I ever loved, and we had a son, and I thought that was my whole life laid out modest and warm in mine. Her name was Celeste. She sang That's How We Met. She came into a club where I was playing and asked if she could sit in, and she sang St. James Infirmary, so slow and so ruined that the whole room forgot to drink. I married her 8 months later. We had our boy Elias, and for 5 years we were poor and completely happy, which I've since learned is a combination most people never get to have even once. And then Celeste got sick. It was her heart, a condition she'd had since childhood and never told me about because she didn't want to be a woman I worried over. By the time we knew how bad it was, we were counting months. I want to give you one true thing about Celeste, so she's a person to you and not just a reason. She was funny. Everybody remembers her voice, but what I remember is that she was funny, dry, and quick, and a little wicked, and she used to do devastating impressions of the club owners who underpaid us, and she could make me laugh so hard I couldn't play. Even sick, even at the end, she was funny. In the hospital, hooked up to everything, she looked at me one night and said, "Andre, promise me you won't marry some sad woman who plays sad music. I've been the sad singer in this family long enough. Find somebody who laughs." I thought she was just being brave. I didn't understand she was giving me permission, reaching 2 years forward to a bartender from Iowa she'd never meet, telling me it was allowed. She knew me better dying than I knew myself living. In those last months, I wrote her a song. I called it The River Knows. It was the only way I had to say the things too big to say out loud, that I would carry her, that our boy would know her, that some part of what we were would keep flowing after she was gone, the way the river doesn't stop just because you take your feet out of it. I played it for her the night before she passed in the hospital on a little electric keyboard. A nurse helped me sneak in. She cried and she said, "That's the one, Andre. That's the one they'll remember." She meant it as a comfort. She had no idea. I recorded "The River Knows" one time alone in a friend's studio, about a month after the funeral, because I needed to get it out of my body and into the world so I could stop bleeding it. I wasn't trying to sell it. I gave a rough copy to a producer named Lionel Beaumont, who ran the biggest label in the South, Crescent Sound, because Lionel had known Papa Joe and I trusted him, and I thought maybe he'd help me place it with a singer, get a little money for Elias. That was my mistake. That was the whole tragedy right there in one act of trust, because Lionel Beaumont heard "The River Knows" and he heard money. Now let me tell you who Lionel is, because you'll want to picture him. He's a big, warm, charming man who wears white suits and calls everyone family, and has spent 40 years convincing black musicians in this city that he's one of the good ones. The label man who actually loves the music while quietly building an empire on their publishing rights. He knew exactly how the game worked and exactly how few of the men who made him rich understood contracts. He'd done it 100 times. I was supposed to be number 101. What Lionel did was elegant, and it took me 2 years to fully understand it. He took my rough recording. He had a young star on his label, a smooth R&B singer named Deuce, re-record it with a full production. He registered the song's copyright through a publishing company he controlled, listing Deuce and a Crescent Sound staff writer as the songwriters and burying my name entirely. And he had paperwork, a development agreement I'd signed months earlier when I was half dead with grief. A document I thought was about session work that contained a clause assigning Crescent Sound the rights to any and all compositions I shared with them during the term. I'd signed away my wife's song without knowing it, in a fog of casseroles and funeral bills, because a man I trusted told me it was standard and where to sign. "The River Knows" came out under Deuce's name, and it did exactly what Celeste said it would. People remembered it. It was everywhere that summer: cars, weddings, a car commercial, then a film. It made, I would later learn, somewhere north of $4 million. I saw none of it. My son heard his mother's song playing in a grocery store and tugged my sleeve and said, "Daddy, that's Mama's song. They're playing Mama's song." Happy because he was 6 and didn't understand, and I had to stand in the cereal aisle and smile at my boy while something inside me died a second time. The night I told you about at the start, the awards night, was the local music awards, and I only went because a friend was nominated and begged me to come play the after party. And there was Lionel, and there was Deuce accepting an award for Song of the Year for "The River Knows." And Lionel got up and gave a speech about how the song came to Deuce like a message from the Lord. And my son, who I couldn't find a sitter for, was sitting next to me in a little clip-on tie, and he looked up at me with Celeste's exact eyes and said, "Daddy, why is the bad man holding Mama's song? Did you give it to him? Did you give it to him?" Out of the mouth of a 6-year-old. And I had to answer him. And the only honest answer was yes. Yes, I gave it to him. I trusted the wrong man with the most precious thing I had, and now he's on a stage taking a bow for your mother's love, and I don't know how to get it back. That was the night the quiet man decided to get loud. But I had nothing. That's what you have to understand about how impossible this was. I had a signed contract that appeared to give Crescent Sound everything. I had no money for lawyers. The 2 I consulted took one look at the development agreement and told me gently that I'd signed my rights away and that fighting Lionel Beaumont was a good way to spend money. I didn't have losing to a man who had teams of attorneys on retainer. I had grief and a son and a song that everyone in America now believed belonged to somebody else. I was by every legal measure a man who had given away his wife's last gift and had no standing to complain. This is where Emily comes in, and I have to tell you I almost missed her because I was in no condition to see anybody. Emily Hartman was a bartender at a club where I played a regular Tuesday night set, a low-money gig I kept because the piano was good and the owner let Elias sleep in the back office when I couldn't find childcare. Emily was from Iowa, from a farm town whose name I could never remember, and she'd come to New Orleans 2 years earlier, chasing a music dream that hadn't worked out the way dreams don't. She had a voice I'd heard her sing once closing up alone, thinking no one was listening, and it stopped me cold, a high, cracked, aching thing like light coming through a broken window. But she'd stopped trying. Life had sanded her down. She poured drinks and sent money home to a sick father, and had, I think, quietly given up on the reason she'd come. I knew her the way you know anyone you see every week without really seeing them. She knew my Tuesday order, and she was kind to Elias, saved him the cherries from the drink garnishes, called him Little Man. That was the whole extent of it until the awards night, because I came into the club after that ceremony wrecked, and I sat down at the piano when the room was empty, and I played The River Knows, the real one, my version, the way I wrote it. And I didn't know Emily was still there closing up until I finished and heard her crying quietly at the bar. "That's the Deuce song," she said. "That's The River Knows." "No," I said. "That's my wife's song. Deuce's song is a copy of my wife's song. There's a difference even if I'm the only one left who can hear it." And I told her. I don't know why I told a bartender from Iowa the whole thing when I hadn't been able to tell anyone. Maybe because she'd heard the difference. Maybe because she was crying. I told her about Celeste and the hospital keyboard and Lionel and the contract and my son in the cereal aisle. She listened to all of it without saying a word, and when I was done, Emily Hartman wiped her face and said the sentence that changed everything. "I used to intern at a music publishing company in Nashville," she said, "before I gave up. I know how copyright registration works. And Andre, if you wrote that song before you signed anything with him, there's a version of the truth that's older than his paperwork. We just have to find where you left it." Where I left it. That phrase. Because a song leaves footprints if you know where to look, and Emily knew where to look. I have to slow down and tell you about those first weeks of working together, because they were the beginning of everything, and they were nothing like romance. They were two tired people at a sticky bar table after closing, surrounded by legal pads, drinking bad coffee, chasing a ghost. Emily would bring Elias grilled cheese from the kitchen and set him up with crayons in the booth while we worked, and she never once made it strange that a 6-year-old was part of the deal. She just folded him into it, asked his opinion on things, let him help by stacking papers. One night late, Elias fell asleep in the booth, and Emily took off her own cardigan and laid it over him. Without breaking her sentence, without even seeming to notice she'd done it, and I noticed, and something in my chest that I thought had died with Celeste turned over in its sleep. I didn't say anything. It wasn't time. But I noticed. What struck me about Emily in those weeks was that she'd clearly been brilliant at something once, and life had convinced her to forget it. When she talked about copyright, about publishing splits and registration dates and the machinery of how a song legally becomes somebody's, she lit up. She got fast and sharp and sure, and then she'd catch herself dim back down, apologize for going on. Somebody had taught her that her competence was a burden. I recognized it because grief had taught me the same thing about my music, that the thing you're best at can become the thing that hurts most to touch. We were two people covered in dust from something we used to shine at helping each other wipe it off, and neither of us called it that yet. Now I need to be honest about the slow way things grew between Emily and me, because it was slow and it needed to be, and if I tell it too fast, I'll cheapen it. I was not looking for a woman. I was 2 years widowed and still sleeping on my side of the bed, and Emily wasn't looking to be anybody's rebound or anybody's savior. What we had first, and for a long time, was a shared project. Getting my wife's song back, and a kind of recognition. Two people who'd both stopped believing in the thing they were best at, circling each other with enormous care. She helped me because it was right, not because she wanted me, and I let her help because I was drowning, not because I saw her yet. The wanting came later quietly, the way the river rises. You don't notice until your feet are already wet. Here's what Emily found, and here's how we built the impossible case. The song left footprints in 3 places. First, I'd played The River Knows for Celeste in the hospital, and it turned out a nurse had recorded a few seconds of it on her phone. She'd been so moved she'd wanted to remember it, and she'd posted it without the song's name, just a caption about a man playing for his dying wife. That video was time-stamped, and it was dated 8 months before I ever signed a word with Crescent Sound. Emily found it by combing through months of posts from the hospital staff. Second, the friend whose studio I'd recorded my rough version in had the raw session files with metadata dated a month after the funeral, still 6 months before the development agreement. Third, and this is the one that mattered most, Papa Joe, my grandfather. He'd been alive when I wrote the song in his last year, and I'd played it for him, and this is the part that undid me. Papa Joe had recorded it. On the old reel-to-reel tape recorder, he used to capture everything. The one thing of his I'd kept sitting in a closet at my place gathering dust. Emily made me dig it out, and on that tape, in my grandfather's shaky voice, was a date spoken out loud, the way he always did, before a recording. Here's my grandson Andre playing a song he wrote for his Celeste, and today is, and he said the date, almost a year before Lionel's contract. My dead grandfather had notarized the truth without knowing it. We had the truth. What we didn't have was a way to make it matter because the contract still said what it said, and Lionel's lawyers would argue that no matter when I wrote it, I'd assigned the rights. This is where it got dangerous, because when Lionel found out I was gathering evidence, and he found out because this is a small city and he had ears everywhere, he stopped being charming. First, he tried to buy me off. He invited me to his office, all warmth family, and offered me a songwriting consultant position and a settlement, real money than I'd ever seen, in exchange for signing a document confirming that Crescent Sound owned The River Nose free and clear, and that I waived all claims forever. He put the check in front of me. It had enough zeros to change Elias's whole life, college, a house, everything I'd failed to provide. And Lionel leaned back and said, "Andre, your grandfather would want you to take care of that boy. Take the money. Let the song go. It's just a song. You'll write others. It's just a song." He said that to me about the last thing my wife ever heard me play. And I understood sitting there that the money wasn't a kindness. It was a muzzle. He wanted to buy not just the song, but my silence, my agreement to the lie, my signature on the story that Celeste had never existed in it at all. And I thought about my son in the cereal aisle, and I pushed the check back across the desk and I said, "You knew my grandfather Lionel. So you know he'd rather I be poor and telling the truth than rich and holding your pen." Lionel's warm face went flat, and for the first time I saw the thing underneath the white suit, and he said, "Then you're going to lose son, and you're going to lose loud, and everybody's going to watch." That's when he came after Emily. Because Lionel figured out that Emily was the engine, that this quiet bartender was the one who knew how copyright worked, who'd found the footprints, who was turning my grief into an actual case. So he got her fired. A word to the club owner who owed Crescent Sound favors, and Emily lost the only job keeping her afloat, the job that paid for her father's medicine back in Iowa. And then Lionel's people did something crueler. They dangled the thing she'd given up on. A Crescent Sound. A&R man reached out to Emily out of nowhere and offered her a development deal, a real shot at the singing career she'd crossed the country for, on one condition never stated but perfectly clear: stop helping Andre Toussaint. They offered her the exact dream she'd buried in exchange for my wife's song. I found out, and I went to her, and I told her to take it. I meant it. I said, "Emily, this is everything you came here for. I'm not going to be the reason you gave it up. I'll find another way." And Emily, I'll never forget this. Emily laughed this broken glass laugh and said, "Andre, do you know why I stopped singing? Not because I wasn't good enough, because I found out what you have to become to make it in that world, what you have to sign and who you have to smile at, and I couldn't do it. And now the same man who breaks people like you is offering to make me a star if I'll help him break you. That's not my dream. That's my nightmare wearing my dream's face." She wiped her eyes, furious. "I turned him down before I even told you because I didn't want you to talk me out of the one decision I've been proud of in 5 years. Now sit down. We're not done." That was the night I stopped seeing a helper and started seeing Emily, and I still didn't do anything about it because we had a war to win and a boy to protect, and it wasn't the time. But something in me that had been closed since Celeste opened a crack, and the light that came through it was the color of a broken window voice. Before I tell you how we won, I have to tell you about the lowest night because I nearly quit, and if I pretend I didn't, I'd be lying to you. After Emily got fired and turned down Lionel's deal, things got very hard, very fast. She had no income. Her father's medicine back in Iowa cost money she suddenly didn't have. I was barely making rent on club gigs. And Lionel, sensing weakness, sent his lawyers to file a preemptive motion. They went after me for breach of the very contract I was trying to escape, claiming that by gathering evidence and talking about the song, I was violating a confidentiality clause. And they threatened to come after what little I had, including they implied my ability to provide a stable home for Elias. It was Grayson Vale's playbook. It was Charles Ashford's playbook. It's always the same playbook: find the child, aim there. I sat on my kitchen floor that night, the same floor, the same posture of a beaten man. And I thought about Lionel's check with all those zeros, and I thought I could give Elias a house, college, everything Celeste wanted for him, All I have to do is agree that his mother was never in the song, and for about an hour, God help me, I wanted to take it because I was so tired and because I'd started to believe the thing they wanted me to believe, that I was a fool who'd signed his rights away and deserved to lose. Emily found me like that. She'd come by to drop off some papers and found me on the floor. And she didn't give me a speech. She sat down on the floor next to me in the dark, and she took Papa Joe's tape recorder. I'd had it out, and she pressed play, and my grandfather's voice filled the kitchen. This here's my grandson Andre playing a song he wrote for his Celeste. And then my own younger hands playing the song True, and Celeste in the background of the recording humming along, because I'd forgotten she was even in the room that day. Her voice, alive on the tape. Emily let it play all the way through, and then she said very quietly, "That's what he's asking you to sign away. Not a song. That, her voice on your grandfather's tape in your kitchen. You want to hand that man a piece of paper that says none of this happened." And I couldn't. I could not. Emily had understood something I'd lost sight of, that this was never about money. And the moment I let it become about money, Lionel had already won. She put the recorder in my hands and folded my fingers around it and said, "You keep this. And tomorrow we go find the others, because you are not the only person he did this to, and there is strength in that if we're brave enough to go get it." That was the night. Right there on the floor with my dead wife humming through my dead grandfather's tape recorder and a living woman refusing to let me quit. Here's how we won, and it wasn't in a courtroom, which surprised everyone, including me. Emily's instinct was that Lionel Beaumont had done this before, that The River Knows wasn't his first stolen song, just his most profitable. And if we could prove a pattern, we could turn one grieving man's word against a powerful label into something no label could survive a story. So we found the others. Emily tracked down 4 more musicians, 3 of them old, one of them the widow of a horn player who'd trusted Lionel and signed his development agreements, and watched their songs come out under other names. Most had given up exactly like I almost did, worn down, and convinced no one would believe them, over a man in a white suit. But Emily, and this is her real gift, could make a person believe their own truth again. One by one, she got them to talk. There was one in particular I'll never forget. His name was Sylvester, and he was 78, and he'd written a song 40 years ago that you have absolutely heard, a song that plays at half the weddings in America, and he'd gotten a flat fee of $400 for it, and watched another man's name go on it and make millions across 4 decades. When Emily and I found him, he was living in a rent-assisted apartment in the 9th Ward, and at first he wouldn't talk to us because he'd made his peace. He said he'd forgiven it. Digging it up would only reopen the wound for nothing. And Emily sat with him for 3 hours, and she didn't push. She just listened to him talk about the old days. And finally she said, "Mr. Sylvester, I'm not asking you to do this for you. You've made your peace, and I respect that. I'm asking you to do it for him." And she pointed at me. "He's got a little boy. And if we don't stop this man now, in 20 years, that boy is going to be you, old robbed," telling himself. "He's made his peace. You can break the chain. You're the only ones old enough and brave enough to break it." And Sylvester looked at me for a long time, and then he looked at a photograph on his wall of himself as a young man at a piano, and he said, "That boy of yours, he plays." I said he was starting to, and Sylvester said, "Then I'll talk, not for me, for him. So he never has to sit in a room like this when he's my age." That's how Emily worked. She didn't argue people into courage. She reminded them who they'd be protecting. By the end, she'd gathered 4 of them, and each story on its own was a wound. But together they were a pattern. And a pattern is a different animal. A pattern is a predator, and predators are what people can't look away from. And then we did the thing Lionel never saw coming, because he was a man of contracts and courtrooms, and he'd forgotten what city he was in. We didn't sue first. We told the story. I took everything: Papa Joe's tape, the hospital video, the session, metadata, the 4 other musicians, the whole pattern, to a journalist at the Times-Picayune who'd been writing about the exploitation of New Orleans musicians for years and had never been able to pin down the biggest fish. And we played her Papa Joe's tape, my grandfather's voice, the date, the song, my wife. She cried in the interview, a professional journalist, and she said, "This is the one. This is the one I've been trying to write for 20 years. I have to tell you what it cost to walk into that newspaper office, because it wasn't nothing. The 2 lawyers I'd seen had both warned me that talking publicly could be spun as violating Lionel's confidentiality clause, could expose me to more claims, could worst of all be used to paint me as unstable, a bitter man, harassing a beloved local businessman. exactly the kind of story that could follow Elias around this small city for the rest of his childhood. I sat in my car outside the Times-Picayune building for 45 minutes, with Papa Joe's tape on the passenger seat, terrified, because once I told the story, I could never untell it, and if it went wrong, I'd have handed Lionel the weapon to finish me. And then Emily, who'd come with me, who was sitting in that car, holding Elias's hand in the back seat, said the simplest thing. She said, "Andre, you keep asking what happens if we're wrong. Ask the other question. What happens to Sylvester and the widow and your boy if we're right and we stay quiet anyway?" And I picked up the tape and I went inside. The story ran on a Sunday, front page, "The Man Who Owned Other People's Songs." Papa Joe's tape, digitized, was embedded in the online version, my true voice playing "The River Knows" with the date spoken aloud next to Deuce's hit, and anyone in the world could hear for themselves that one was the river and one was the boat somebody stole. The four other musicians told their stories. The city, which loves its musicians the way it loves its dead, fiercely and out loud, lost its mind. Radio stations pulled Deuce's version. The film that used the song distanced itself. And the thing about a story versus a lawsuit is that a lawsuit Lionel could drag out for a decade, but a story he could not untell. The lawsuits came after, and now they came with the whole city behind me and pro bono lawyers who'd read the article lining up to help, and the four other musicians as corroboration, and Papa Joe's undeniable tape as the anchor. Crescent Sound's own artists began leaving because no musician in New Orleans wanted to be on the label that stole a dying woman's song. Lionel Beaumont's empire, built over 40 years on the trust of people he betrayed, came apart in a single season. He settled, of course, he settled. Men like Lionel always settle when the alternative is a jury of New Orleans music lovers, and the settlement returned the copyright of "The River Knows" to me in my name, and Celeste's, plus the earnings that were always ours, plus enough to make the four other musicians whole. He admitted nothing publicly. He didn't have to. The tape had already said everything. But that's not the ending. You know by now that these stories don't end at the money. The ending is a night about a year later at that same little club, my Tuesday gig. Except now the room was packed because everyone knew the story. And I played "The River Knows," mine ours, and then I did something I'd never done. I called Emily up to sing it with me. She hadn't sung in public in 5 years. She stood by the piano, terrified, that broken window voice shaking on the first line. And then it steadied, and then it soared, and Celeste's song filled that room the way it was always meant to, sung by a woman who'd refused a star's career to help a stranger get his wife's love back. And in the front row was Elias 7 now, and when we finished, he stood up on his chair and yelled, "That's Mama's song, that's our song." And the whole room turned to look at the little man in the clip-on tie, and they roared. That night at the club, after Emily sang and Elias yelled and the room roared, an old man came up to the piano afterward. I didn't know him. And he put a weathered hand on my shoulder and he said, "I knew your grandfather, played with Joe back in the day. He used to tell us they own the paper, but they can't own the river. Took 60 years, but somebody finally proved him right in a courtroom." And then he did something that undid me. He took off his hat. An old New Orleans musician took off his hat to a song. And I understood that this had never been only about me and Celeste. It was about every name that got erased off every song in this city for 100 years, and for one night in one club, one of them got put back. Papa Joe was right. You can't own the river. It just takes the right fool with the right tape to remind everyone. Emily and I took it slow even after that. I want you to know that. We'd both been broken by fast things and false promises, and neither of us wanted to build on sand. She started singing again, really singing on her own terms. No white suit, no development deal, just her voice and the truth of it. She and Elias became something before she and I did. She taught him piano when I was gigging, saved him the cherries, showed up to his school recital when I was stuck at a session, and one day he called her Miss Emily, and then months later, without anyone telling him to, he just called her something warmer, and Emily had to leave the room. When she and I finally became an us out loud, it was the least dramatic thing in the world. We were doing dishes after Elias was asleep and she was humming Celeste's song under her breath. And I said, "I think I'm going to love you for the rest of my life, and I've been scared to say it because the last time I loved somebody like this, I had to bury her." And Emily dried her hands and put them on either side of my face and said, "Andre, the river doesn't stop. You taught me that. You wrote a whole song about it. Let it keep flowing." And it did. There's a moment from the year we were falling in love that I keep like a photograph. Elias had a school talent show, and he wanted to play piano, his first time in front of people, and he was terrified, shaking, ready to run. And it was Emily, not me, who knelt down in front of him backstage and said, "You know what my daddy told me before my first show? He said, play it for one person. Don't play it for the whole room, you'll scare yourself. Pick one person and play the whole thing just for them." And Elias said, "Can I play it for Mama?" Meaning Celeste, meaning his mother who was gone, and Emily didn't flinch. Didn't make it about herself. She just said, "That's the best person there is to play for. She'll hear it. Music finds the people it's for." And my son walked out and played a shaky, beautiful, imperfect little song for his mother in heaven, and I sat in that school auditorium between grief and something brand new, and understood that Emily hadn't tried to replace Celeste for 1 second. She'd made room for her. That's the rarest thing in the world, a person who loves you and your child enough to hold space for the ghost instead of resenting it. That was the day I knew. It still took us months more because we did everything slow and sure. But that was the day I knew. We married in the Toussaint on a Sunday, and it turned into a second-line parade the way things do here. Brass band and handkerchiefs and half the neighborhood dancing behind us down streets my grandfather played on 60 years before. Elias led the parade with a toy trumpet, and Sylvester marched right behind him, 78 years old and dancing like a young man, because he'd told me at the newspaper that he never thought he'd live to see a musician in this city win. And now here he was in the middle of the winning in the street, in the sun. And when the band at my request played "The River Knows," slow the way I wrote it, the way Celeste heard it, nobody thought it was strange that the groom cried and the bride sang and the whole street sang with her. Because in this city we know that the people we love don't leave when they die. They just move into the music, and the music never stops. And a good song can hold a first wife's love and a second wife's voice at the very same time and not break, because love isn't a thing that runs out. It's a river. It knows. With the settlement money, I did something Lionel never expected. I didn't buy a big house. I started a little nonprofit. I named it after Papa Joe, that does one simple thing. It helps New Orleans musicians, especially the old ones, understand and reclaim the rights to their own music for free. Sylvester runs the front desk. The widow of the horn player does the intake. Emily teaches the copyright class. The same knowledge she once apologized for having, now the most valuable thing in the building. We've helped 40-some musicians in 3 years get back songs they thought were gone forever. Every one of them, when the paperwork clears and the song comes home, I make them do the same thing. I make them say the date out loud into a recorder the way Papa Joe taught me. Witness your own truth. Never let it go unrecorded again. So that's how a quiet man from the Toussaint took down the biggest label in the South with a dead man's tape and a bartender's stubbornness. My wife's song belongs to my son now, free and clear, and he'll pass it to his kids. And Lionel Beaumont's white suits are in a closet somewhere, gathering the dust that used to be on Papa Joe's recorder. If this story moved you, do that thing I asked at the start. Hit subscribe so the next story finds you. And leave me a comment. Tell me about a song or a thing that holds somebody you lost. I read them, all of them, because I know now that the things we make out of love don't die when we do. They just wait on an old tape in a closet for the right person to press play. And if you're out there tonight and somebody powerful is telling you to take the money and sign away something that can't be bought back, a song, a name, a piece of the truth about someone you loved, I want you to hear this from a quiet man who almost did it. The check felt like mercy, and it was a muzzle. They always dress the muzzle up as mercy. The truth is worth more than the zeros, and there is more strength than you think in the people who've been robbed the same way you have. If you're brave enough to go find them and stand together. My grandfather couldn't own the river, and neither can they. Press play on your own life. Say the date out loud. I'm Andre Toussaint. The river knows. Thanks for listening.